The people that are about to speak to you are very special to me. I first met Chuck Pennacchio in 2006 when he was running for Senate, Democratic primary. He came here to Kutztown, and that gentleman right there was acting as his campaign manager, my friend John Morgan in the back. And he came to Kutztown to ask us for our support. And I remember after his speech, I was very impressed. I don't remember what question I asked Chuck, but whatever the question was, I remember the first line in his response. And that line was, the first thing that has to happen is the politicians in Washington have to grow a spine. When he said that, I felt like Renee Zellweger when Tom Cruise came to her and Jerry Maguire and started giving her this big long spiel about why he had success tonight, but it wasn't complete because he couldn't share it with her. She stopped him in the middle of that and said, "You had me at hello." Chuck had me at spine. He had me at spine. Since then, Chuck has been engaging in a battle for you and a battle for me. It must be a lonely battle. I don't know how he does it. Because as we sit on the sidelines, there are people like Chuck working around the clock to change this God-forsaken healthcare system in this country. And it's time for us to stand up and get behind guys like Chuck and support them. I no longer am going to sit on the sideline after I saw what happened to Tina. And I urge you not to as well. So please join with me in giving a warm welcome to our keynote speaker, Chuck Pennacchio.
Thanks so much, Chuck. I really appreciate it. And that was quite a long time ago, it seems, running for the United States Senate. And what motivated me to run then is what motivates me to continue to stay active in politics. For 40 years now, I've been going at this. I just turned 53. I've been at this heavily since the age of 13. So it's been a long haul. It's been very gratifying, and to meet such wonderful people along the way. The folks here in Kutztown, wow, the passion in this place, I don't know if you have an appreciation for what it means, but I did, traveling across the state. You care so deeply about your community, you care so deeply about your state, you care so deeply about your country and the world. And we are all interconnected. We all have a special responsibility, and not everyone who gets that. But I'm grateful when I encounter folks who do. And near the top of my list, or at the top of my list, are Ron and Rosie, who exemplify activism at a very high level, and a passion and principle that is very moving. And they keep me going. I have to say that you motivate me to do what I do. And to my left, and our second speaker tonight, I'd be remiss if I didn't thank Dave Stott, a former Republican legislator, who, in my encounters in the State House, was the clearest thinker on single payer, sometimes we call it one payer. It's certainly everybody in and nobody out. But Dave has been a real leader in Harrisburg, and now since leaving Harrisburg in the business community, and more recently, he signed on as president of Healthcare4AllPA, Pennsylvania. And for Dave, his friendship, Ron and Rosie, Chuck, and the folks here at St. Barnabas, and the people of Kutztown, thank you all so very much. Appreciate it. I'd like to, in the 15 minutes or so that I have to present tonight, is lay out a larger picture, a context, that I hope will put our work in proportion and give ourselves a sense as to what we face in terms of this larger challenge of placing the United States back into frankly, in the United States, our healthcare system is completely uncivilized. And that's one of the reasons, one of our phrases for our campaign is civilized healthcare for all. And many people who see that on a brochure, they stop and they say, what do you mean civilized? Well, civilized means that we need to live up to the credo of this nation. We need to revisit what it was that gave our nation its birth. Our birthright is the general welfare. This concept, for the people, by the people, of the people, these concepts are not without meaning. And the general welfare is written throughout our U.S. Constitution. And I keep going back to the Constitution expecting to see corporate welfare. I keep expecting to see that the original design of this country was to give greater power and greater might to corporations. But quite honestly, the recent Supreme Court decisions have made our work that much more challenging. And those decisions, of course, have to do with whether it's the Buckley v. Vallejo decision about campaign funding that really began to open the door for the decision of the Supreme Court a few years ago that now equates money with speech. So the more money you have, the more speech you have. And the more money you have, the more citizenship you have. And then more recently, the Citizens United decision, which I think clearly cemented for many people, in the minds of many people, the fact that we in this room are now second-class citizens of the United States. Stop and think about that. I don't hear anybody else saying that out there in the public. Maybe I'm missing it, but I don't see it. And I think it's very important that we grapple with this and to take this as our clarion call, that we are going to reclaim our citizenship, our full citizenship rights, because they have been systematically denied to us and taken away from us. And I think the healthcare fight is the seminal fight, because healthcare touches the vast majority of our population. The reality is that about 98% of us are vulnerable. And by that I mean that only the super rich, only the 2% at the top, can afford to dig themselves out of major medical crises. The way that the system is created right now is that it's really created a wedge. It's created a challenge for all of us. But if we recognize, and I've done this with Tea Party folks, they'll show up to our forums, I'll go to them. You actually have a conversation with them, and they support the single-payer solution after you have a rational discussion, one-on-one. But if you're having a discussion in an environment of a rally or where people are caught up in emotion, it becomes much more difficult. So then another one of our challenges here is that so much of our politics is emotional. It's so partisan. And people are unfortunately easily manipulated into thinking that things are different than they actually are. So one of my challenges as a parent, as a professor, as the leader of Healthcare4All Pennsylvania, is to pull ourselves back from these emotional responses, these talking points, these misleading threads, and these open lies by the two major political parties on the healthcare issue. And I say that with a great deal of forethought. It's been very frustrating to see recent political developments, but at the same time, I believe that, that once we get past this election cycle, we will have maybe one of our last true opportunities to wrestle this healthcare issue into a place where we can truly achieve universal healthcare. As an historian and a teacher of American politics at University of the Arts in Philadelphia, I'm always pulling my students back, as I've indicated, to look at the larger picture. And let me do that for a few minutes here and just paint a picture of how we got where we are today, where you have a Democratic Party that is running in defense of the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, also shorthanded as the Affordable Care Act, and sometimes attacked as Obamacare, but Obama says that he's okay with that term, so if I use it, you'll all appreciate that, hopefully. So the Democrats have sunk their teeth into Obamacare, And most of American institutions, including the editorial page of the New York Times, refers to Obamacare as universal health care. Universal health care. Now, that is just a flat-out lie. And this is a problem because the way that stories are presented in our media, if the New York Times says it, it must be gospel truth. And we can all say amen in a church now that the New York Times has said that Obamacare is universal health care. And what that does is it gives license to others to mislead us. But the reality is that on a best-case scenario, Obamacare will fund about 30 to 32 million Americans by the year 2019. But the reality is that people are losing health insurance at almost equally the same rate. Now, where are you going to hear that? Where is that being discussed? So we're actually not keeping pace. And in terms of economic sustainability, we're not keeping pace. And why is this? Because the insurance industry is still in charge. They're still in charge. We can tell ourselves that Obamacare has created reform that reins in the insurance industry, but the reality is that they have to live by a certain set of rules. But what they do is they game the rest of the system, so they never see a loss of dollars. So this is what I refer to as the medical-industrial complex. And this is an institution whose roots go back to the very early fight around universal health care. So historically, the first prominent politician to call for universal health care was Teddy Roosevelt, who ran as a third-party candidate, a Bulldoze candidate, in 1912. And what Teddy Roosevelt said was that it is the moral duty of the United States, and also it's in our economic self-interest, to create a system of universal health care. He ran on universal health care in 1912, did Teddy Roosevelt. And in fact, there was a labor bill that was being pushed in the 19-teens, and believe it or not, it was supported by, at that time, the American Medical Association. And it actually had some traction in the 19-teens. There actually was a chance we were going to get universal health care in the 19-teens during the Progressive era. Unfortunately, the United States entered World War I, and that brought an abrupt end to progressive reforms and the early hope for universal health care. Following World War I, the American Medical Association switched its position, and they decided that no, health care should be something that is privately acquired, and we need to shift to a health care purchasing model. So you then begin to see this advent of privately purchased health care in the 1920s. Labor didn't pursue the fight the way that they should have, and in fact, labor unions were split on the question of universal health care going forward. And this is actually a challenge that all of us who are sympathetic, and I'm a member of a labor union myself, the American Association of University Professors, is that labor split, and there was not a unified effort going forward. And labor, to this day, is divided over how to proceed because many labor contracts have been hard fought, and they fought for and earned health care benefits. So labor's not exactly been on the same page. That makes it a challenge today, and that fight dates back to the 19-teens and 1920s. So where that takes us in the 1920s is in a society that was very reactionary and was focused ever more on a private economy, capitalism. We know what ultimately happened in the 1920s. Capital grew out of control. The economic crash in 1929 led to the Great Depression. The Great Depression then in the 1930s gave us an opportunity to revisit the question of universal health care. It was revisited during the New Deal by Franklin Roosevelt. His advisors were split. They were pushing on Social Security, and Social Security, which did pass in 1935, did provide benefits for the elderly, for the unemployed, for children who lost their parents, and for those persons who were disabled. But a political decision was made in the White House not to push all the way on universal health care. The president, I think, said with some regret in 1944, this is a year from the point at which he's passing away, in his State of the Union in 1944, he was the second prominent politician, now an elected president, who in his State of the Union said in the Economic Bill of Rights speech that universal health care is and should be a right of the American people. Roosevelt passed away a year later, and Harry Truman picked up the gauntlet, and he too called for universal health care. And he more closely approximated the single-payer model that we're discussing here today, the one-payer model where it's publicly funded, right? Publicly funded, like Medicare, and privately delivered, like Medicare. You have your choice of physicians. That idea actually has a germination during the Roosevelt-Truman years of the 1940s. We're ending then at World War II. But what's fascinating about what was occurring during World War II is that businesses, especially military industrial, but those who were contracting with the government to fight fascism globally, they were fighting for employees. And the way that they were able to get the best employees was to provide employer-based health care benefits, employer-based health insurance. And that's where the employer model of health insurance comes from. It comes from World War II. So you've got these two contradictory directions going, right? Well, after World War II, of course, Congress became much more conservative. Harry Truman fought for universal health care as well as a series of other programs known as the Fair Deal, but politically he was beaten by a much more conservative Congress. In the 1950s, health costs began to escalate and escalate quite dramatically in the 1950s. In the beginning of the decade, the country was spending 4.5% of its GDP, gross domestic product, on healthcare. At the beginning of the 1950s. By the end of the 1950s, that number had doubled. And today, we know that we're now rapidly approaching 18% of our gross domestic product being spent on healthcare. Healthcare costs have escalated, they've grown out of control, and they've grown out of control for a variety of reasons in the 60s, and the 70s, and the 80s. However, in the 1960s, there was another opportunity to get universal health care, even despite this background. The AMA was very powerful at this point, the American Medical Association, but Lyndon Johnson, a champion of a liberal welfare state, the Great Society, pushed on health care, but again, he, like Roosevelt, was advised not to go all the way. And so, what Lyndon Johnson did is he settled for Medicare, right, which is universal health care for the eligible, 65 and above, and Medicaid, which is a program that was to provide basic rudimentary care for the indigent. But those costs of health care continue to escalate. Nixon introduced us to these HMOs, these health maintenance organizations. And HMOs were a way for insurance companies essentially to cobble together and create group plans that created a separation between the wealthier and the wealthy in our society and the less well-off. And this has morphed into our current system, which is that we now have a system of what I call medical apartheid, which is to say that we have the best medical care in the world for the very rich, which is about 2%, but we don't have adequate, basic health care for most of the rest of the population. We have a system where people walk around thinking they have insurance, but they find out when a catastrophe hits that they don't really have good insurance. We have this problem in the United States of medical bankruptcy, which is driving so many people who play by the rules. It's a bait and switch. It drives them into absolute financial ruin. We need to unify as a society. We need to pull together as a society. We need to recognize our common place. We need to recognize our basic humanity, what it is that binds us together. This is both an economic issue and a moral issue. On the economics, Dave is going to do, I think, a fabulous presentation talking about why it is we need to move toward single payer, one payer, why it makes absolute common sense. But just to carry forth the moral thread that was begun with Teddy Roosevelt's clarion call in 1912 for universal health care. And it's been resounded through the ears by individuals both in the public sector and the private sector, by presidents, by members of Congress, by other community leaders. It's time. It's past time. It's time to roll up our sleeves and get this done. We get this done in Pennsylvania, and it will spread like a wildfire across our state borders, and it will set the tone for the United States, and we can then refer to ourselves once again as a civilized nation. Thank you.